So welcome, Gitte.
Thank you very much. So Jesper and I worked together for 5 months, and it was really cool because we are very good at different things, which I think is one of the best teams that you have. If you have kind of the same values and you're very good at different things, because if we're all good at the same things, it would be boring. So I'm going to talk about psychological safety today. And Jesper asked me, can you do something interactive? Now you're working at Mentimeter, which is true. So I've been actually practicing using Mentimeter, because that's not why I started working there. It was because I think they have an awesome culture. So let me see if I can figure out how to share this. I'm going to start out with 2 questions. And one thing you can do to go into this survey is you can go to menti.com and use the code. But another trick that I have just learned is that you can also scan the QR code.
Let's try that.
So the first question that I would like to ask you is, who do you think has the responsibility for ensuring that we have psychological safety at work? You can share up to 6 things. And the idea is that hopefully once you start sharing, it should become a word cloud. Team members is one option. Everyone, me, manager, HR. So we're actually seeing a lot of these is about, there's like 2 things or 3. There's team, there's everyone, and then there's like manager, people of privilege, HR. For me, I think that like the official one responsible for ensuring it is, of course, the managers or the privileged people. They have the company, they are the ones who've been responsible for this. But the true thing is that all of us are responsible for psychological safety, because this is something that all of us either contribute to or prevent from happening. So I think that all of these answers are actually correct. So psychological safety is something that has been known about for years, but didn't really come up in the media or in the IT industry until a few years ago. And one of the things was that Amy Edmondson, who's a professor at Harvard, so she did some research in hospitals. She looked into which are the teams, the departments in the hospitals who have the most safe environment. And what do you think the findings was? Do you think that the safe teams reported fewer errors, equally many errors, or more errors than psychologically unsafe teams? So one of the things that Amy Edmondson was looking into is kind of like, what difference does it make for us when we go in and have psychological safety? Does it actually make a difference compared to the things? Oh, looks like you're really good at this. So as we can see, we have a vast majority, like everyone, saying that reported more errors. And that's actually true, and that's what confused her in the beginning. Is it looked like the departments that had psychological safety actually reported more errors. And the thing is that the people feeling safe were not afraid to report the errors. So there were equally many or more errors in the other departments, but they were afraid to share these things. So now that I've done something interactive, I'm going to stop doing that. I'm going to return to my beloved PowerPoint. A little bit about me. I am native wired on Twitter. Be aware that if you follow me, I tweet a lot. And my pronouns is she and her. For many years, I've been an agile coach. And I like to use this picture because some people say that, oh yeah, you're all tree hugging people. And this tree was very nice, so I hugged it. But I use this picture because the parts of agile coaching I have been working on has mainly been the people and interaction part. How do I help people communicate? How do I help them collaborate? So basically on all the soft skills, which I don't like to call them because they're actually quite hard. So that's kind of what I've been working on. I have also been speaking at a lot of conferences the last 7 years. I started 8 years. I started, but the year more and more. And one of the good things about being remote is that you can speak in a lot of different places, including Göteborg, which is far away, as we all know. I just started as a engineering manager and agile coach at Mentimeter, which means I will be having some direct reports that I will be helping out to grow and reach the potential. And I will also be helping the organization with things that I learned as an agile coach about how do we ensure a psychologically safe environment as we are growing, and in general about doing change. And then I'm a lot of other things. I am known for my hugs, for doing a little bit of crazy stuff sometimes, and for having the courage to speak up about some of the things that people don't. So one thing that I've heard a few times is we don't really need psychological safety. People can just do things, they can just speak up. I even heard like only the bad developers need psychological safety because everyone else is going to just find a new job. But the thing is that no matter how good you are, if you are feeling psychologically unsafe, you are not going to go find a new job because you're going to be convinced that it's all your fault. So I like this quote by my friend Torbjørn, where he says, "Things become better when we accept them as they are, not as we want them to be." Not meaning we should just accept everything, but we need to accept where things are. And we need to accept that, yes, it would be magical if all of us were just brave enough to speak up and admit mistakes and all of those things. But that's not how it is. And we need to take a starting point where we are and not where we wish we could be. So, wrong way. So basically, psychological safety was first mentioned, at least the first mention I found, in 1965 when Edgar Schein and Warren Bennis was looking into how can we create a good environment for people to learn. And one of the things they found out was that we need a bit of discomfort to be able to learn things. But there's a difference between people who feel safe in this discomfort and people who don't. So people who do not feel safe will have a high anxiety, and people who feel safe will have an increased desire to learn. And while this is many years ago, we still, not a lot happened with this actually. Maybe in some learning environments, but not a lot especially in the IT industry. William Kahn started looking at it in 1990 about engagement and disengagement at work. But Amy Edmondson, who I think is one of the best researchers of this, started looking at it in 1999 and looking at safety when solving real world problems. That was not her original intention, but as we saw in the survey, people who feel safe actually report more mistakes because they're not afraid of reporting it. If we look into the IT industry, we have Google. In 2014, Google did Project Aristotle, where they were looking at what creates a high-performing team. And they were expecting something like the level of education in the team, how many engineers do we have, and stuff like that. And they didn't really get to some results until they started looking at the softer things. We also have things like modern agile, which talks about making safety a prerequisite for actually doing agile, and in my opinion, doing any other kind of work. So what Google found out was that there are 5 factors that we need when we have a high-performing team. There is dependability, that teams get stuff done on time and are excellent. that people have structure and clarity, they have clear roles, they know what to do, they have clear goals, that the work is important to each of the team members, and that they have an impact, that the team members actually know what I'm doing right now has an impact. But the thing that made the really big difference was this psychological safety, that the team members felt safe in risks and also being vulnerable in front of each other. And I think this is not something that is everywhere in Google. We hear a lot of stories about the opposite, but the teams that they were measuring that were high performing had this. And if nothing else, one of the things that Google has done is put this on the map and having a lot of companies look into these things. So the definition that I like to use is the one from William Kahn, which talks about psychological safety is being able to show and employ oneself without fear of negative consequence of self-image, status, or career. And I think the important part about this is that it's about a fear, which means that if you are feeling unsafe, it might not be logical. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you speak up at work, you're going to be ridiculed, for instance, and lose image. But it does mean that you are afraid of it. So in general, it's about not being afraid to be punished for things we do at work. So some of the things that we talk about they talk about in Modern Agile, for instance, is not being afraid to be yourself, not being afraid to speak up, have a different opinion than people in the room, make mistakes, and take risks. And there are several reasons why this helps us when we have high-performing teams. One is that if we are afraid, a lot of our brain activity is actually here because we're afraid, we are watching out for things. And what we really want in our organizations is we want to be in front. We want to be where creativity sits, where innovation sits. And also to be able to get to the really cool products, we need to take small risks. Not big risks that will make things fail big, but we do need to be able to take risks, because if we don't try things out, we are not going to see something new. So some of the things that Amy Edmondson talks about is helping us with is asking questions, admitting mistakes, offering ideas, and challenging norms. And while these can seem as, of course, we're going to do these things, she says, asking questions instead of staying quiet in fear of looking ignorant. So the first time I was working with psychological safety, one of the things we found out was that the more senior people were, the more uncomfortable they were asking questions, because they felt like they should know about all these things. So if you're not in a safe environment, you are not going to ask these questions. Very often when I've been talking to teams, we've been talking about, you start new, the first month you feel it's okay to ask questions, but then you kind of go, I should know this. But it was a surprise to me then that it was also a big thing with people who've been there for a very long time, because they felt even more that they are supposed to know these things. The admitting mistakes is instead of hiding because we don't want to look incompetent. The offering ideas is instead of holding on to them because we are afraid we will be intrusive. And challenging norm instead of just sitting back because we don't want to look negative. So all of these is fears that we might have in an unsafe environment or an environment that feels unsafe for us. And I think that's something that's very important, is that if you've been in an unsafe environment for a very long time and you come into an environment that is actually safe, you are still going to have this fear. In my first job, I was part of a bunch being fired. They fired 10% minus one person, so they didn't have to involve the union. And what happened was that a high-level manager would come in, he would tap someone on the shoulder and say, do you have a moment? So for a very long time, if somebody would come that I did not expect, tap me on the shoulder and say, do you have a moment? I would get terrified. My body would remember that this is now I'm getting fired. So even though we are in a safe environment, we can still feel all of these things. And I think that's something that's important to remember. And it's important once we start working with safety is that it can be very individual from person to person. This is an example of a very unsafe environment. So Boeing had this 787 Dreamliner, and what happened is one plane fell down and it was not done much about it. When the second one fell down, it was all put back. But what actually happened is that a lot of these people were being punished or fired if they were talking about concerns. Because Boeing really, really wanted this plane to fly. It really, really wanted this Dreamliner. So they were shutting down people who were raising concerns. And in this case, it literally killed people. Not all of us work with stuff that can kill people. I mean, what I'm working with now is a presentation tool. I'm not sure anyone has been killed for a presentation, except maybe in some dictator state. I don't know about that. But otherwise, we are working with quite safe things in that way. But still, that fear is there. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. But sadly, there's a lot of places where fear is what drives people. Another thing that's important to know and remember about psychological safety is that it's not always about comfort. If you are raising concerns, for instance, let's say you are a tester and you find a huge bug just before something goes into production, that's probably not going to be comfortable to raise that as an issue. Or if you are a developer and you take down the whole system. Or if you are a manager and you realize that the way you phrased some things or the way you acted made somebody feel insecure and actually got them to cry, for instance. Safety is about being able to be in that discomfort. Being able to know that even though this is not comfortable right now, I am safe. I am not going to be punished for this because it is okay to make mistakes. So some people have especially been challenging Amy Edmondson about performance. And so this is one of the things she brings up in her book, Fearless Organization. And what she talks about when she talks about performance is low standard and high standards. And this actually means both internally and externally. So do I as a person have high standards for performance? Will kind of fall in the same box as if the organization has high standards. We can also, and if we look at this compared to psychological safety, if we have low standards and we have low psychological safety, we have the apathy zone. It's not really important how we do. And besides, we don't want to cause any problems, so we don't speak up about it. If we have high standards for performance, whether that is internally or externally, and we have low psychological safety, what happens is we will be in the anxiety zone, which can be a really horrible place to be. And that's kind of where our reptile brain takes over and tries to protect us. And the big problem with this is it's not good for us as humans. It's not good for the company because we are not doing the right things. We are not learning. We are not developing. And in general, it's a terrible place to be. And I did it again. If we have low standards and high psychological safety, which we see in some organizations, it's more like a comfort zone. It's very nice to be here, but not much happen, not much innovation, because we're not really holding ourselves to any standards internally or externally. And while this is a nice place to be, this is really not where we want our organizations to be. We want our organizations to be in the quadrant where we have high standards for performance, not meaning that we push people because then we don't have the safety, but meaning that we have expectations of people to perform, and they also have expectations of themselves. And this is the zone where we really want to be. This is the learning zone, this is the high performance zone, and that is where we want to be, especially in the organizations that we have in the IT industry and in many other industries where we have knowledge work. Because knowledge work is one of the things that is usually not repetitive. If you're doing the same repetitive work over and over again, you don't need as much safety. It's more when we need to actually use the knowledge parts of our brains, which again, more and more organizations are going to. But this is really where we want to go, because that's where we learn, and that's where we can have high performance. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I realized yesterday that we promised to talk about is also how to create this safety. And as a general rule, creating safety is something that takes a long time. It takes deliberate work, and it's a little bit individual from organization to organization. And we also need to be aware that, for instance, the one about bringing yourself to work or being your whole self can create unsafety for other people. And what I usually say is, who you are is always okay. What you do might not be. So one of my friends, Morgan, that I do this with sometimes, he says like, yeah, what if I'm a nudist and I kind of want to go to work naked every day? That's going to make other people feel uncomfortable and unsafe sometimes. So it's very much about bringing yourself with respect, still respecting other people around you. So the first safety here I have is from Amy Edmondson, where she talks about, as an organization, we have 4 domains we need to look into. We need to look into what is our attitude to risk and failure. So what we want to do is we want to prevent risks that are preventable and failures that are preventable. So as an IT organization, for instance, having a good test framework, automatic test framework, will catch some of the preventable failure, which means that we have more space to go in and do the things we cannot predict. But also the whole attitude about it, like what happens if you do make a failure, if you do take a risk? Is that something that is held against you? Is it something we learn from? Or, is it something that, okay, this happens and we're just going to hide it? So these things is something where you need to have an environment where it is safe to fail. And one of the things that's cool about working in an iterative way is that it's easier to fail small if you just do small things at a time. And by failing small, it's not as risky to fail as it is if you just do big bang. Another domain that she talks about is willingness to help. So what is the willingness to help in the organization? Do we help out people sitting next to us, in our team, in our department, in the organization? And my experience is that it's easier to build the smaller the group is. But of course, you can then expand it once you have safety in smaller groups. But looking at what is the willingness to help in this? Do we have open conversations? Can we actually talk about the different elements that's happening? Can we talk about if something is happening so that we need to fire people in the organization? We are hit by Corona, we need to fire people. So that's something we can talk about. But also talking about, okay, we are growing, so we need to hire more people, or we need to change the organization. Any kind of thing, but also small things. Do we actually have this open conversation? And then it's about inclusion and diversity. So diversity, the way I usually describe it, is about inviting anyone in. We want to have different kinds of people. Very often when I see diversity, it's about gender or ethnicity. But we also want diversity in people with different mindsets, coming from different schools, different age. Maybe we need people with different abilities, because all of them bring something to the table. But if we have diversity without inclusion, what happens is we expect everyone who comes in to act our way. So one of the things that I see in some organizations, for instance, is that they talk about culture fit. We want culture fit. And what you risk with culture fit is that either you only get the same kind of people, or you get people who will twist themselves to fit into your culture. That being said, of course, you need, if your culture is something very specific, you do need to value that as well. But if we just invite people in who are like us or willing to act like us, we won't have that inclusion. And the interesting thing about having inclusion and diversity is that it can sometimes make things harder. It's harder to make decisions. It's harder to agree on things. But the power that it brings, having this, is worth all the trade-off, in my opinion. The other is so much easier when we all believe the same things and want the same things and have gone to the same school, so we like the same tools. It just doesn't provide as much value. Another aspect that Amy Edmondson uses to look at is what can you do as a leader? So she very much talks about it from a manager point of view. But when I talk about these things, I also mean it as an unofficial leader. So no matter what your role is, you lead by example. But very often people will be leading in one situation or another. Maybe you are the one who starts writing something down when we're talking about something. That's also being a leader. But she talks about 3 things that you can do. And the first one is framing work as learning. So much of what we do, especially in the IT industry, is actually about learning. We are not doing the same thing over and over and over again. At least not a lot of the work we do. And even if we are, we are still learning things. We are still moving. And by framing things as learning instead of production, it becomes safer, because when we are learning things, we might not learn it right away. So just by framing this, we can create some safety. And the other thing is about modeling curiosity. So if somebody doesn't agree with you or comes up with a different suggestion, instead of being defensive that they don't like your ideas, be curious. Oh, this is really interesting. What makes you think like this? What are the things that you that make you think of this thing? Because I haven't considered that. And as I think, especially if you are a manager for people, I think that curiosity and listening to hear what's being said is very important. And the last thing that she talks about is showing fallibility. So as a leader, actually being vulnerable and showing that you make mistakes as well. That you forgot to do something, or that the sound didn't work when you started out your webinar. Admitting these things, and also for me, being careful about how you frame it. Because if you say, oh, I was so stupid, I made this mistake, you're saying people who make mistakes are stupid. But owning your mistakes and saying, I made this mistake, I'm very sorry about it, help me learn from it, for instance. That is something that creates safety. I also put in a few of my own things that I work with when I work with creating safety, whether it is in teams or in organizations. I find that one of the things that can make people feel very unsafe is if the expectations are not clear. And these can be expectations from the manager, what do I expect of you? But it can also be, what are we actually working on? What is expected of me in this situation? And we talk a lot about autonomous teams in our in Agile. And even if you are autonomous, there are expectations for you. For instance, one of the often unsaid expectations to being autonomous is that you take responsibility. Because otherwise, I can't say that. Being self-driven doesn't help. it's very important to listen to people. And this is a skill that many of us have not learned. It's a skill that I did not learn until, okay, I'm not going to say how many years ago because it makes me feel old. But we very often listen to answer something. But listen to hear what people are saying is part of creating that safety, making people be seen and heard, helping them get their voice. Actually caring, I think that's part of what is also creating safety, that we care about other people, we care about the product, we care enough to do something. Giving and receiving feedback, and also sometimes learning how to give and receive feedback. Because that is the way we know if the things we are doing are okay or not. Whether that is code that we are creating or something we say or whatever, it is about our behavior and our actions. And giving and receiving feedback on that and not on who we are is something that helps create safety as well. Being vulnerable yourself. So no matter who you are, if you are a team member, if you are a manager, if you're the owner of the company, if you're on the side, you can be vulnerable. I was talking to a recruiter the other day, and one of the things he said is that when I can feel that the person that I'm talking to is really nervous, I start sharing a little bit of myself and about how I was nervous or how I find it hard to do interviews online sometimes, because that makes the other person relax. Which is very interesting because he had not heard about psychological safety. He just instinctively knew that if I share a little bit of myself, the other person relaxes more. Being curious, I also put on here because I think that learning to go, oh, this is interesting, instead of what is this, is an attitude that, first of all, has brought me a lot of interesting conversations, but it's also something that helps people feel safe. It's about, oh, this is really interesting. What is going on with this? And then to listen more to people, because we often don't listen enough. Also, repeating yourself. Sometimes when we say these things to people about, for instance, expectations or feedback, or even the curiosity and the mistakes, it's a good idea to repeat yourself, because the other person might not be in a state where they hear these things. And of course, yes, this is a new slide. Notice it says 4. You should repeat yourself.
Of course.
So, wrapping up, psychological safety is really important, and it is something that enables us to create high-performing teams. Safety does not always mean comfort, though comfort is something we need once in a while. It takes a lot of effort, and it's totally worth it, in my perspective, both from a human point of view, but also as a co-worker, company owner, whatever it is. And you can do something no matter what your role is. So I think these are the essential things. Are you able to share the slides afterwards, Jesper?
Yes, we are.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. I will then send the slides to Jesper. If you are not comfortable asking questions today, I have loads of information here, and there's a bunch of links also if you want to learn more about these things.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Gitte. Thank you so much. So that was very interesting. I thought I made some notes during your talk here. What we'll do now is it's free to write questions in the chat, and we're going to take a look at it. But I'll start out with a few questions of my own. As an agile coach that I am as well, so I'm always looking for the next thing to do in array of things to do. So what would you say to start with? What would be the absolutely first step to get a little bit closer to psychological safety in a work environment?
So I think that the listening and being vulnerable, I think those are the important things. Showing people that, especially, I was going to say us as consultants, but I forgot I'm employed. Especially coming in as a consultant, very often we are seen as the expert. Now we're coming in, we know everything. And I think that being vulnerable in that situation and also saying, and being humble, I'm coming in with my expertise on agile in whatever form it is. By the way, if you want to know anything about Jaya, just ask Jesper and never me. But coming in with that and saying, this is what I'm good at, but there's also stuff that is not my expertise. And one of them, of course, is the company that we're coming into. And then listening to people and saying, what is the thing we can help you with, or I can help you with? I think that's the first part about making yourself vulnerable and creating that space where you can actually build connections. I would say that's the first part in creating safety.
Okay, good. Then you mentioned in the talk the situation when someone is knocking on your back. Do you have a minute situation? And that can be very uncomfortable, especially, as you said, if people are fired. But I wanted to hear your perspective. If you want to approach a person and talk to them, if there are any, how should you do that and still, make them feel safe? I want to talk to you, but how can I do that?
Yeah, and I think this is a special thing for me because I was fired this way. So other people might not react this way. And I think one of the things is that if we do have a safe environment, I could say to you, you know what, Jesper, never do that again because I got fired that way. Mm-hmm. Because I think that it's also about getting to know each other a little bit, because some people go like, yeah, just come talk to me. And other people would like to have, okay, if we're going to talk about something important, I want to know, I want to prepare, I want to read about it first. So I think it's very individual from person to person. But I think the reason I mention it is that we need to be aware that other people can have triggers, and we have triggers from other situations. So I do think the whole, do you have a minute to talk? And if you feel like the person might be nervous, saying, do you have a minute to talk? I'm just curious about some things, if it's not a big thing. To kind of, yeah.
All right, so we have a couple of questions in the chat. So I'm reading here. We have first one, does psychological safety mean anybody can say anything and mindful hurting others' sentiments?
No, definitely not. And I think that's one of the things we talked about the first time I was introducing psychological safety was, for instance, what about jokes? Does this mean we can never say jokes anymore? Because a joke might hurt someone. Yeah. So this is kind of the opposite of it, is that you are afraid to speak up to not hurt anyone. And the idea is you can make a joke, but if you have a safe environment, the other person is feeling safe enough to say, that actually hurt me. And it's okay for you to have made the mistake of doing that joke, because if we only say you can't hurt anyone, then we are creating an artificially safe environment where people are going to be afraid to speak up.
Okay.
But the other part about this is, can you say anything unmindful hurting other sentiments? No. And that's kind of the duality in psychological safety, is that we need to be aware that some of the things we do can actually make other people feel unsafe. One of the things that I do very much, for instance, is I ask for deadlines and follow up on them. And to some people, what they hear when I say, can I have a deadline for that action? They hear, how fast can you do this? And I mean as fast as possible. When what I'm really saying is, I would like to realistically know if you have the time to do this and when you can be able to finish it. But you can't just say anything, because we are a system. And that means that we sometimes need to be careful about it. But I think that the important part is to, if we do that, if we say something that hurts somebody else, that the other person can tell us, and then yes, it's going to be very uncomfortable that I just said this because I didn't mean to, and that's okay as long as it's safe for me to have made that mistake, and then we can talk about it.
All right.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. We'll see. We have a few more here. Next one. How do you keep the psychological safety in a growing organization?
Oh, I think that's a very good question, because I think that the smaller it is, the easier it is to create psychological safety. But I do think that it's about building resilience in the culture. It's about having a culture where it's okay to make mistakes, where it is appreciated when people speak up. Even if people speak up about things where we might not use those ideas, the fact that they raise these ideas and saying, could we do things this way? And even if the company says, okay, no, we've taken that into consideration and we are choosing to do it this way, the fact that you're actually heard and that this is appreciated. So I think it's very much about when an organization grows, to kind of help people understand that they are also part of building this safety, and that once a new member comes in, we can help them feel safe and then spread it that way. But it's also something that you need to be aware of, especially if an organization is growing fast. And it would be something I would keep an eye on, for instance, by making surveys. Amy Edmondson has 7 questions that she uses to ask people to figure out if they feel they're in a safe environment. So on general basis, checking up on these, and then if there is a problem, actually act and talking about these things. And I think that talking about, again, the 3 things that Amy's talked about, talking about learning environment, being vulnerable yourself, being valuable, and being curious about other people will help that.
All right. Yeah. Thanks. I'll see another question here. Yeah, this one. Have you felt that increased remote work because of a pandemic would have affected psychological safety at workplaces?
Oh, very much so.
Yeah. In what direction?
Yeah, I think that first of all, the fact that not only are we working remote, but it's actually a pandemic. That we, at least I and the people I worked with in early 2020 were like, yeah, and summer's gonna be over. So all that insecurity that we have is one of the things that can make it feel very unsafe. Some people don't like being on videos, which we now have to if we are in a video meeting, and other people feel unsafe if they can't see other people. So there are now artificial situations, so to say, that we have not asked for, where we need to maybe have that discussion. There's also the fact that right now you can only see this part, so you can't see my body language. If we are more people in the meeting, you can't see my facial expressions, which also means that it's easier to step on toes. Some people find it harder to speak up in a team meeting that's online, for instance. So I think those are things that are very important to talk about. And I also think the other part of it also, that a lot of people suffered from mental health problems, not because they normally would have that, but because they are not used to being in isolation, for instance. And if you are feeling, this is my own pocket philosophy, if you are feeling bad mentally, you need more safety as well to feel safe. So also being aware of these things. So yes, I do think it has affected our psychological safety, and I think that we need to work even harder on it working remote, and we need to work even harder on it when we have a pandemic.
Yeah, I would agree 100% on that. All right, so we have no more questions here. And I asked a few questions. I'm looking at the clock. Yeah, it's humming in. So I'm looking at my colleague here. Will we survey this webinar? Yeah. So just everyone that participated will get a SurveyMonkey. So we get feedback, and feedback, as we heard, is an important part of the psychological safety, and we need always to improve on our everything we do. So that's important. And I said I'm going to release you before 5 o'clock. And I want to thank you, Gitte, for doing it with us. Maybe there will be some ice cream coming your way, possibly. We'll see. We'll see. And we will be back with more seminars, I think. But so check out our channels for that. And yeah, thank you for listening in. Hopefully this was valuable. There'll be both a recording and get the slides, as well as a SurveyMonkey coming your way.
Yeah, and feel free to contact me if you have any more questions or just want to talk.
Yeah. Great. So thank you so much for today, and bye-bye. And I also should say hello from a few friends to you, Gitte.
Thank you.